They thought compassion was our greatest weakness. When the Xylar hegemony targeted a marked human hospital ship, they expected panicked doctors and a slaughter. They didn't realize human empathy comes with a steel spine, and our sanctuaries are guarded by the deadliest secrets in the stars. Listen closely. The UNSS Archimedes hung in the absolute zero of the void like a brilliant, pristine beacon against the chaotic backdrop of the Orion Nebula. She was a behemoth, a vessel so staggeringly large that her own mass generated a microgravity field. Painted in blinding, reflective white, her flanks bore the universal symbol of sanctuary, recognized by humanity for over 5 centuries. A massive, luminescent crimson cross. Designated as Hospital Ship 44, the Archimedes was currently orbiting the embattled mining colony of New Kyoto. The war with the Xylar hegemony had been raging for 8 brutal months. The Xylar, a militaristic, highly stratified alien species, viewed the human concept of mercy as a biological defect, a weakness to be exploited. But the United Nations Navy still clung desperately to the galactic equivalents of the Geneva Conventions. They believed that if humanity abandoned its rules of engagement, they would lose their soul long before they lost the war. Deep in the bowels of the Archimedes, Chief Medical Officer Dr. Chloe Bennett was fighting her own frontline battle. Triage Bay 4 was a cacophony of synchronized chaos. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, sterile antiseptic, and the unmistakable, heavy iron tang of human blood. "I need 50 cc's of synthetic platelets. Stat!" Dr. Bennett shouted over the hum of the autodock machinery. Her hands, clad in sterile haptic gloves, moved in a blur as she worked on the shattered chest cavity of a young Marine. "And get that suction cleared, I can't see the arterial tear." Beside her, Nurse David Miller was already moving, slapping a pressurized medical pouch into the IV manifold. "Heart rate is dropping, doctor. He's crashing." "Not on my table. He isn't," Bennett muttered. Her jaw clenched tight. She bypassed the automated surgical lasers, grabbing a pair of physical trauma clamps. The war had exhausted their supply of advanced nanite clotters 3 days ago. They were down to practicing Dark Age medicine with space-age lighting. "Clamp. Clamp got it. Miller, stabilize his core temp. We're holding him." The Archimedes was currently housing over 14,000 critically wounded soldiers, along with 3,000 civilian refugees evacuated from the orbital bombardment of New Kyoto. The ship was pushed to its absolute limits. Originally, the vessel had been laid down in the Boeing Lockheed orbital shipyards above Mars as a Titangent-class heavy dreadnought. However, mid-construction, the Earth Parliament had voted to slash the military budget, repurposing the massive half-built hull. Only a dreadnought frame possessed the immense, heavy-duty structural integrity and the quad fusion reactor output required to power thousands of stasis pods, atmospheric scrubbers, and industrial-scale medical replicators simultaneously. Up on the command bridge, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the bloody, frantic energy of the medical bays. The bridge was bathed in calm, low-blue tactical lighting. Captain Ethan Cole stood at the massive viewport, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. Cole was a man who looked exactly like the burden he carried, deep lines etched into his face, graying hair cropped in a strict military fade, and eyes that had seen far too many young men and women leave in body bags. "Status of the evacuation shuttles, Lieutenant?" Cole asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded absolute silence. At the helm, Lieutenant James Ford tapped his console. "The last 3 dropships, Pelican 4, 7, and 9, are on final approach, Captain. We'll have the last of the Priority 1 casualties aboard in 12 minutes. After that, we are at 110% capacity." Cole sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. 12 minutes. Let's pray. The hegemony stays distracted by the Third Fleet on the far side of the moon. As soon as those bays are sealed, spool up the warp drive. We jump for the Sol system. "Aye, Captain," Ford replied. The Archimedes was completely unarmed. The Ares Accords, the interspecies treaty attempting to govern the rules of war, strictly forbade the arming of designated hospital ships. No missile pods, no point defense turrets, no offensive lasers. In exchange, these ships were supposed to be granted absolute immunity from attack. Cole followed the book to the letter, trusting the blinding white paint and the crimson cross to be his armor. But out here in the dark, a treaty was just a piece of paper, and the predators of the void were currently looking for a soft target. The first warning was not a klaxon, but a subtle, chilling drop in the ambient hum of the bridge's sensor arrays. Lieutenant Ford leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he stared at the primary long-range radar screen. A sudden spike of tachyonic radiation was blossoming on the edge of the system's gravity well. "Captain," Ford's voice cracked slightly, losing its professional sheen. "I'm reading a localized slipspace rupture. Sector 4, Alpha. It's dangerously close." Cole turned slowly, the heavy weight of command suddenly pressing down on his shoulders like a physical object. "Identify." "3 contacts," Ford said, his fingers flying across the holographic interface to filter the telemetry. "Hegemony energy signatures. 1 Vindicator-class heavy cruiser, flanked by 2 Scythe-class destroyers. They just dropped out of FTL. Distance: 40,000 kilometers and closing fast." A cold silence fell over the bridge. 40,000 kilometers in space combat was point-blank range. "Did they overshoot the fleet engagement?" asked Commander Sarah Higgins, the ship's chief engineer who had just stepped onto the bridge to deliver the reactor reports. "No," Cole said quietly, staring at the magnification of the jagged obsidian-black alien warships on the main screen. "They're on a direct intercept course for us. They bypassed the blockade entirely. Captain, we are squawking the Ares Accord's non-combatant codes on all frequencies. Broad spectrum. They have to see we're a hospital ship," Ford said, though the desperation in his voice betrayed his logic. "Keep broadcasting, Jimmy. Open a direct hailing frequency to the lead cruiser. Unencrypted." Cole straightened his uniform jacket, stepping into the center of the holographic comms circle. The air shimmered, and the brutal, insectoid reptilian visage of a Xylar fleetmaster flickered into view. The alien's mandibles clicked rapidly, translated by the ship's AI into a harsh, metallic English. "Human vessel, this is Fleetmaster Vrax of the Hegemony. Your presence in this sector is a violation of Hegemony expansion protocols." "Fleetmaster Vrax," Cole replied, his voice steady, channeling every ounce of diplomatic restraint he possessed. "This is Captain Ethan Cole of the United Nations Hospital Ship Archimedes. We are a designated non-combatant vessel carrying 14,000 wounded soldiers and civilians. We have no armaments. We are currently concluding evacuation procedures and will be departing the system. I remind you that under the Ares Accords, firing upon this vessel constitutes a supreme war crime." The alien's mandibles clicked in a rhythmic, chattering pattern, a Xylar laugh. "Your accords are a fiction of a weak species. You shelter the broken to send them back to the slaughter. To the Hegemony, there are no non-combatants, only the strong and the prey. We have scanned your vessel, Captain Cole. You have no shields capable of withstanding our plasma batteries. You have no weapons. You are a fat, bloated target, and your destruction will break the morale of your pathetic military." "Rax, listen to me." Transmission severed, the alien hissed. The hologram vanished. "Captain," Ford yelled, "they are locking targeting telemetry on us, spooling up forward plasma lances." Down in Triage Bay 4, Dr. Bennett had just managed to stabilize her patient when the deck beneath her boots violently shuddered. It wasn't a rumble. It was a violent, concussive slam that threw her and Nurse Miller into the bulkhead. The sterile white lights flickered, died, and were instantly replaced by the blood-red strobes of emergency power. "What happened?" Miller gasped, pulling himself off the floor. The ship's internal comms crackled to life, filled with the sound of shrieking metal and panicked voices. "Hull breach in Sector 7. Medical wards C and D have lost atmospheric containment. Automated bulkhead sealing." Bennett looked out the viewport of the triage bay just in time to see a massive, jagged chunk of the ship's white outer hull slowly drifting away into the blackness, trailing a horrifying mist of crystallized oxygen and frozen debris. "My God!" she whispered. They're actually shooting at us. On the bridge, Cole gripped the railing of his command chair, fighting to stay upright as another volley of plasma fire raked the ship's port side. "Damage report!" Cole roared. "We've lost wards C and D, Captain," Commander Higgins reported, her hands moving frantically over the damage control console. "Atmosphere is gone. We lost." "Captain, we just lost over 400 patients and staff in that strike." Cole's breath caught in his throat. 400 souls, gone in an instant. The sheer, callous brutality of the strike defied all human comprehension. "Captain, the Xylar cruiser is adjusting its pitch," Ford shouted over the wailing klaxons. "They are charging their spinal heavy laser. They're not trying to disable us anymore. They're lining up a kill shot to core our main reactor. Impact in 90 seconds. Cole looked around his bridge. He saw the terror in his crew's eyes, the flashing red warnings projecting across the glass. He thought of Dr. Bennett down in the triage bays, fighting to save lives with her bare hands, only to be incinerated by a cowardly predator. He thought of the Geneva Conventions, the rules that separated humanity from the monsters. But right now, the monsters were at the door, and the rules were just getting people killed. "Higgins," Cole said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "Override the governor on the main reactor. Divert all auxiliary power, life support reserves, and gravity generators to the central spine." Higgins stopped dead, turning to stare at him. "Captain, if I do that, the medical replicators go offline. We break the treaty." The treaty died when they vented Ward C, Commander," Cole barked, the fury finally breaking through his stoic veneer. "Do it! Authorized protocol Hippocratic loophole." Commander Sarah Higgins stared at the captain, her face completely drained of color. The bridge was a cacophony of blaring proximity alarms and the panicked shouts of junior officers, but in that specific fraction of a second, a heavy, suffocating silence seemed to envelop the engineering station. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. She didn't hesitate a second time. "Protocol authorized," Higgins said, her voice shaking only slightly as she slammed her hand onto the biometric scanner at her station. The console flashed a brilliant, unforgiving green. Unlocking the central spine. When the United Nations Naval Engineering Corps had repurposed the Archimedes from a Titangent-class dreadnought hull into a hospital ship, they faced a nearly insurmountable logistical nightmare. A medical vessel designed to serve millions of personnel across light years of hostile space required an astronomical daily supply of highly unstable, short-lived medical isotopes critical for emergency radiation therapy, advanced cellular imaging, and deep tissue nanite regeneration. You could not simply stockpile these materials. They had to be manufactured on demand. To solve this, the engineers utilized the empty 3-kilometer-long spinal column of the warship. In the space where a military spinal mount weapon would normally sit, they installed a massive, linear CERN-Westinghouse particle accelerator. It was a staggering feat of industrial medicine. The system was designed to electromagnetically accelerate heavy, 5-ton target slugs of solid tungsten, smashing them into a heavily reinforced containment chamber at the very bow of the ship to harvest the resulting shower of medical isotopes. Legally, officially, and structurally, it was a medical device. The Archimedes remained completely unarmed, fully compliant with the Ares Accords. But physics is fundamentally uncompromising. If you manually override the safety protocols, open the heavy containment chamber doors at the bow directly into the vacuum of space, and accelerate a 5-ton solid tungsten medical waste slug down a 3-kilometer magnetic corridor, it is no longer just an isotope generator. It becomes the single largest, most devastating kinetic railgun in the Orion sector. Deep within the cavernous underbelly of the ship, the massive superconducting magnetic coils began to spool up. The sound was an unnatural, terrifying phenomenon, a rising tectonic whine that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly through the very bones of the crew. In Triage Bay 4, Dr. Chloe Bennett felt the titanium floor plates humming furiously beneath her boots. The sterile, white surgical lights abruptly flickered and died, plunging the bay into a terrifying gloom illuminated only by the frantic, flashing yellow of emergency battery backups. The ship was ravenously cannibalizing its own power grid, starving life support, artificial gravity, and propulsion, all to feed the dormant beast waking in its spine. "What is happening to the power?" Nurse David Miller shouted, desperately hand-pumping a manual respirator as the automated systems around them began to stall. I don't know," Bennett replied, her hands slick with blood as she clamped down hard on her patient's ruptured artery. "But it feels like the whole ship is winding up for a punch." "Keep pumping, David. Don't let him slip." Out in the blackness of space, the hegemony cruiser hung like a jagged obsidian dagger against the stars. On its bridge, Fleetmaster Vrax watched his tactical displays with a smug, predatory satisfaction. "The human vessel is experiencing massive internal power fluctuations," his sensor officer hissed, clicking its mandibles rapidly as it read the telemetry. "Their life support is failing. Their maneuvering thrusters have gone dark. They are dying from the inside out." "Excellent," Vrax purred, a guttural sound echoing in his throat. They push their reactor past its limits in a desperate, pathetic attempt to keep their weaklings alive. "Are our forward plasma lances fully charged?" 95%, Fleetmaster. "Firing sequence is locked dead center on their primary reactor core. We will vaporize them in one volley." Back on the bridge of the Archimedes, Captain Cole stood anchored behind his command chair, staring at the magnification of the alien warship on the main screen. The deck beneath him was violently vibrating, the ambient temperature of the bridge plummeting as environmental controls were shunted to the magnetic accelerator. "Ford, adjust our pitch," Cole commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble cutting through the chaos. "Align our bow directly with the center mass of the hegemony cruiser." "Aligning, sir," Lieutenant Ford grunted. His hands were white-knuckled on the navigation yoke, fighting the sluggish, unresponsive controls. Without primary maneuvering thrusters, turning the colossal 3-kilometer ship was agonizingly slow. The blinding white nose of the Archimedes drifted through the void, millimeter by millimeter, until the tactical reticle turned solid red, resting directly over the black heart of the alien flagship. "Bow containment doors are open and locked," Higgins reported, her fingers flying over the heat management readouts. "Magnetic coils are at maximum charge. We have a 5-ton tungsten slug loaded into the breech, Captain. The simulated recoil on this is catastrophic. The ship was never designed to fire this into open space. We are using our own internal support struts as a shock absorber. It might literally tear our structural spine apart." "Hold us together, Higgins," Cole said softly. He reached down to the edge of his command console. He unlatched and flipped open a small, heavy glass cover that hadn't been touched since the ship's christening at the Mars shipyards. Beneath it lay a heavy, mechanical red switch. On the hegemony cruiser, the sensor officer suddenly shrieked, "Fleetmaster! The human vessel's power spike! It is not a reactor failure! It is a localized, directed energy buildup in their central axis. Massive magnetic flux detected." Vrax's eyes narrowed. "Impossible. They have no weapons." "Vrax," Cole whispered to the empty bridge, his eyes locked on the jagged alien ship that had just murdered 400 of his defenseless patients. "Do no harm, unless forced." Cole slammed his fist down on the red switch. The Archimedes fired. For a fraction of a second, the universe seemed to hold its breath. Then, a blinding, terrifying streak of blue-white light, born from atmospheric friction, ionized particles, and pure, unfiltered kinetic rage, erupted from the nose of the hospital ship. The recoil was apocalyptic. The sheer physical trauma of launching 5 tons of mass at relativistic speeds shoved the 3-kilometer-long dreadnought violently backward. Bulkheads screamed in metallic agony, heavy structural support beams snapped like dry twigs, and artificial gravity briefly collapsed under the sheer, unforgiving physics of the shot. Every crew member on the bridge was violently thrown to the deck amidst a shower of sparks and shattered glass. The tungsten slug exited the barrel at roughly 0.04% the speed of light. In the cold vacuum of space, it was effectively invisible. There was no glowing, sustained laser beam. No dramatic trail of missile exhaust. There was only a hypervelocity spear of dense matter crossing 40,000 kilometers in the blink of an eye. Aboard the hegemony cruiser, Fleetmaster Vrax didn't even have the time to process the warning. The tungsten slug struck the heavy cruiser dead center. Advanced Xylar energy shields, designed to absorb and disperse superheated plasma and deflect high-intensity lasers, were entirely useless against an object of that sheer mass and density moving at relativistic speeds. The kinetic spear pierced the reinforced obsidian alloy armor of the alien ship as easily as a high-caliber bullet tearing through wet tissue paper. The kinetic energy transfer was so absolute, so devastatingly complete, that the front half of the alien warship simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. It didn't explode in a traditional fiery ball. It structurally shattered on a molecular level. The shockwave of the impact turned the titanium alloy bulkheads into a spray of superheated, pressurized plasma that vaporized the alien crew instantly. The rear half of the ship, carried forward by its own momentum, violently crumpled into the vacuum left by the displaced matter, collapsing in on itself in a catastrophic structural failure before the main reactor went critical. It bloomed into a silent, brilliant, expanding star of pure annihilation. The two flanking hegemony destroyers immediately aborted their attack runs, their pilots banking violently away in sheer terror to escape the expanding, molten blast radius of their completely obliterated flagship. On the bridge of the Archimedes, a heavy, stunned silence reigned, broken only by the hiss of ruptured coolant lines and the sparking of blown consoles. Captain Cole slowly pulled himself up using the armrest of his command chair, wiping a thin trickle of blood from his forehead. He looked out the shattered viewport. Where the terrifying, unstoppable alien cruiser had been, there was now only an expanding, glowing cloud of metallic dust and vapor. "Direct hit," Lieutenant Ford whispered from the floor, his eyes wide, completely awestruck, as he stared at the primary long-range radar. "Target destroyed. Captain, we just one-shot a Xylar heavy cruiser." "The destroyers?" Cole asked, his voice strained but ironclad. They're running, sir," Ford stammered, scrambling back into his seat. "They're spooling their FTL drives. They are jumping out of the system. They're absolutely terrified." Cole exhaled a long, shaky breath, the immense weight of the moment settling over him. "Stand down the accelerator, Higgins. Reroute all surviving auxiliary systems and get power back to the medical bays immediately. Dr. Bennett has patients to save." The silence on the bridge of the Archimedes was heavier than the artificial gravity that had just slammed back online. Outside the massive viewport, the expanding cloud of superheated plasma was the only evidence that a Xylar heavy cruiser had ever existed. Captain Ethan Cole slowly released his death grip on the command console. The ship was groaning, a deep structural metallic agony echoing from the central spine. The recoil of accelerating 5 tons of tungsten to relativistic speeds had exacted a terrible toll on the dreadnought hull. "Damage control, report!" Cole barked, his voice cutting through the stunned haze of the bridge crew. Commander Sarah Higgins' hands danced across her diagnostic screens, her face pale in the blue light of the monitors. "Captain, the magnetic accelerator is completely burnt out. The primary superconducting coils melted into slag down 80% of the barrel. We essentially used the ship's skeleton as a giant heat sink. If we try to fire that thing again, it will crack the ship in half. We are totally disarmed." "It did its job," Cole replied grimly. "Ford, what's the status of the FTL drive? I want us out of this system before the hegemony realizes what just happened and sends the rest of their fleet." Lieutenant James Ford was already working the navigation yoke. "Spooling up now, sir, but the power diversion to the medical accelerator tripped the primary relays. The jump drives need 7 minutes to cycle and align. 7 minutes, and we are ghosting to the Sol system." "Get it done," Cole ordered. He tapped his comms earpiece. "Dr. Bennett, this is the bridge. Power is routing back to your bays. Status?" Deep in the bowels of Triage Bay 4, the emergency red strobes finally clicked off, replaced by the harsh, blinding white of the surgical overheads. "Doctor." Chloe Bennett didn't even pause to celebrate the return of the lights. Her hands were already deep inside the chest cavity of a critically wounded Marine. "We are holding, Captain," Bennett said, her voice tight with strain. "But the gravity failure nearly killed half the ICU. I've got patients crashing." I need every ounce of auxiliary power you can spare routed to the automated Johnson & Johnson trauma docks in Ward E. And, Captain, I don't know what you just did up there, but thank you. Cole offered a grim, unseen nod. Keep them alive, Doctor. Cole out. He had just severed the connection when a piercing, shrill klaxon erupted across the bridge. It wasn't the deep, booming alarm of a ship-to-ship attack. It was the frantic, high-pitched wail of internal security. Ford's head snapped up. Captain, I'm reading a massive atmospheric fluctuation in Sector 7, right next to the blowout in medical wards C and D. Show me, Cole demanded. A holographic schematic of the ship materialized between them. Sector 7 was flashing violently in red. When the cruiser fired its plasma lances, we assumed the debris in Sector 7 was just shattered hull plating, Ford said, his fingers flying across the console to isolate the sensor data. But it wasn't. The hegemony didn't just try to destroy us. They fired a boarding torpedo under the cover of the plasma barrage. It latched onto the exposed titanium decking right before we obliterated their flagship. Higgins looked up, horrified. Boarders? On a hospital ship? They're Xylar Hunter caste, Cole said, his blood running cold. They want the ship. They saw our power spike. They know we just turned a non-combatant vessel into a dreadnought killer. They want our technology, and they will slaughter everyone in their path to get to the main reactor. The holographic map zoomed in. 7 distinct, heavily armored thermal signatures were moving through the darkened, vacuum-sealed corridors of Sector 7. They were moving with terrifying speed, cutting through the internal emergency bulkheads with thermal breachers. Where are they heading? Higgins asked. Ford traced their trajectory, his face draining of color. They're bypassing the armories. They're taking the most direct route to the central spine and the reactor controls. Captain, their path takes them straight through Triage Bay 4. Cole's heart hammered against his ribs. Triage Bay 4 held over 300 critically wounded patients who couldn't be moved, along with 50 unarmed medical staff. Security, Cole yelled into the open comms channel. Dispatch all available provosts to Deck 12. Outside Triage Bay 4. Lethal force authorized. Captain, a panicked provost sergeant replied over the static. We only have standard-issue Glock sidearms and stun batons. We're riot control. We don't have armor-piercing munitions to stop Hunter-caste shock troops. You hold that line, Sergeant, Cole roared. You buy those doctors time. Higgins, seal every bulkhead between Sector 7 and Deck 12. Drop the blast doors. Ford, give me a countdown on that FTL jump. 5 minutes, Captain. Down on Deck 12, the reality of the war had finally breached the sanctuary. Dr. Bennett heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of the security blast doors dropping shut down the primary corridor. Nurse David Miller sprinted into the operating theater, his face pale. Chloe, the bridge just issued a code black. Hostile boarding party. They're cutting through the ship, heading right for us. Bennett froze, her hands hovering over the sterile field. She looked around the massive triage bay. Row upon row of biobeds, occupied by unconscious soldiers missing limbs, civilians with plasma burns, and children hooked up to respiratory machines. Evacuate who you can, Miller urged, grabbing a stack of portable IV bags. We have to run. Run where, David? Bennett snapped, her voice shockingly steady. To the escape pods? We have 300 people on life support in this room. If we unhook them, they die in 3 minutes. We aren't going anywhere. They have plasma rifles, Chloe. They're going to execute us. Bennett turned to look at the massive array of heavy medical machinery dominating the far wall of the bay. Specifically, she stared at the Siemens Lockheed Mark IV magnetic resonance imaging suite, a machine so powerful it required its own dedicated fusion microgenerator, designed to map the cellular structure of a human body in real time. A dark, desperate realization dawned in her eyes. Humanity had just turned a medical isotope generator into a ship-killing weapon. Perhaps it was time to improvise again. David, Bennett said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. Go to the engineering terminal on the wall. Override the safety governors on the MRI suite. What? Chloe, if I drop the magnetic shielding on that thing, It'll pull the fillings out of our teeth. Do it, Bennett yelled. Then grab every high-intensity surgical laser we have, the heavy-duty necrotic tissue burners. Override the optical safeties on those too. We are not going to die cowering under our desks. Outside Triage Bay 4, the reinforced titanium blast doors began to glow a vibrant, angry cherry red. 7 Xylar hunter caste warriors stood in the darkened corridor. They were hulking, insectoid nightmares standing over 7 feet tall, clad in interlocking plates of active camo armor. In their primary limbs, they carried heavy fusion plasma repeaters. To them, the humans on this ship were nothing more than cattle, weak, fragile creatures who wasted resources trying to save the broken. The heavy thermal breachers sliced through the final locking mechanism of the blast door. With a deafening screech of tearing metal, the door was kicked inward by a massive armored foot. The Xylar squad leader hissed a command, clicking its mandibles. "Purge the room. Leave no survivors. Secure the reactor pathway." The aliens charged into the medical bay, expecting to see cowering nurses and fleeing doctors. They expected the sweet scent of human terror. Instead, they found Triage Bay 4 completely dark, save for the eerie blue glow of the stasis pod. Standing in the center of the room, completely exposed and wearing a blood-stained white lab coat, was Dr. Chloe Bennett. She held a small, wireless medical tablet in her hand. The Xylar squad leader raised its heavy plasma repeater, aiming it squarely at Bennett's chest. The alien let out a guttural sound that translated roughly to a sneer. Weakness. Under the Ares Accords, this is a sanctuary, Bennett said, her voice projecting clearly across the silent room. You are trespassing. The alien's finger tightened on the trigger. Bennett tapped the screen of her tablet. So I'm prescribing you a magnetic enema. She executed the command. Behind the wall to the alien's right, the Siemens Lockheed MRI suite activated with no shielding and 0 safety restraints. The machine drew raw, unfiltered power directly from the ship's grid. Instantly, an artificial magnetic field of nearly 40 Tesla was generated in the room, a force so overwhelmingly powerful it warped the very air. The Xylar hunter caste wore armor forged from high-density, magnetic hyperalloys. They carried weapons built from heavy combat steel. The squad leader didn't even have time to fire. The massive magnetic field hit the aliens like an invisible freight train. The heavy plasma rifles were violently ripped from their 4-fingered grips, flying across the room and smashing against the reinforced wall of the MRI chamber. But the weapons were just the beginning. The aliens themselves, encased in magnetic armor, were lifted entirely off their feet. With a chorus of terrified, clicking shrieks, all 7,000-pound shock troops were dragged horizontally through the air and slammed violently against the steel bulkhead housing the MRI machine. They were pinned there, completely immobilized, crushed against the wall by a magnetic force equal to the gravity of Jupiter. "Miller! Now!" Bennett screamed over the deafening hum of the machine. From the shadows above the observation deck, Nurse Miller and 3 orderlies popped up. They weren't holding guns. They were holding high-intensity industrial medical lasers tools designed to instantly cauterize massive trauma wounds or burn away dead tissue. "Close your eyes," Miller yelled to the patients. The orderlies triggered the lasers. They didn't aim for the aliens' heavy armor. They swept the blinding, intense beams of concentrated light directly across the unarmored, multifaceted optical clusters of the Xylar warriors. The aliens shrieked in agony as the surgical lasers instantly boiled the fluid in their eyes, permanently blinding them. Pinned to the wall and stripped of their sight, the elite, terrifying hunter caste were reduced to thrashing, helpless insects. On the bridge, Captain Cole watched the internal security feed in absolute stunned silence. He had expected a massacre. He had not expected his chief medical officer to weaponize a diagnostic tool to neutralize a squad of the galaxy's deadliest killers. "Captain!" Ford shouted, breaking the silence. "FTL drives are fully aligned. Jump parameters are locked for Earth." Cole snapped back to reality. "Do it! Jump us out of here!" The Archimedes shuddered violently as the massive warp engines ignited. The stars outside the viewport stretched into long, blinding streaks of starlight, and reality folded around the wounded behemoth. In a flash of tachyonic radiation, The hospital ship tore a hole in the fabric of space and vanished from the new Kyoto sector, leaving the debris of the Xylar cruiser far behind. 30 seconds later, the ship dropped out of slipspace, coasting smoothly into the heavily defended, familiar space of the Sol system. Immediately, the comms channels exploded with automated challenges and interrogations from the United Nations Home Fleet. UNSS Archimedes. This is Earth Defense Command. A crisp, human voice crackled over the speakers. You are squawking emergency codes, and your hull is showing massive structural trauma. We are scrambling interceptors and rescue tugs. What is your status? Cole leaned back in his chair, feeling the sheer exhaustion in his bones. He looked at the internal feed. Down in Triage Bay 4, the magnetic field had been lowered. The blind, disarmed Xylar boarders were currently being zip-tied to the deck by the security provosts, while Dr. Bennett calmly went back to operating on her Marine. Earth Defense Command, this is Captain Cole, he replied, his voice laced with a weary, profound pride. We have 14,000 wounded aboard. We have sustained heavy damage, but we are secure. Understood, Archimedes. We monitored a massive kinetic detonation in your previous sector. Did you have an escort? Cole looked at the flashing red warnings indicating the destroyed magnetic accelerator in the ship's spine. He thought about the Xylar hegemony, a species that believed human compassion was a fatal flaw. They had learned today that humanity's desire to heal its own was so fierce they would move heaven and earth and shatter the laws of physics to protect them. No escort command, Cole said softly. Just a slight modification to our medical equipment. Send the tugs. We're coming home. The legend of the Archimedes spread through the galaxy like wildfire. The Xylar hegemony eventually sued for peace, their morale broken not by a fleet of human dreadnoughts, but by the terrifying realization that humanity would turn their very tools of salvation into weapons of utter annihilation. They learned that the red cross painted on the white hulls was not a bullseye. It was a warning. If you loved this sci-fi HFY story about humanity weaponizing a hospital ship to defend the innocent, smash that like button and subscribe for more epic tales. What did you think of Dr. Bennett's quick thinking with the MRI machine? Let us know in the comments below and share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans. Keep looking up at the stars. And remember, humanity's greatest strength is our compassion, but our second greatest is our firepower. See you next time.